The Acropolis, the sacred rock above Athens, the year 480 before the Nativity of Christ. The air is thick with smoke and the smell of burning. Where ancient temples recently stood, now blackened ruins remain. The great army of the Persian king Xerxes, like a swarm of locusts, has passed through Attica, leaving behind only scorched earth and desecrated sanctuaries. The Athenians, evacuated to the island of Salamis, watch their burning city with pain and fury. It seems this is the end of democracy, the end of freedom, the end of Athens' greatness. But the gods, or perhaps history itself, decided otherwise. In the narrow straits near Salamis, the Greek fleet, outnumbered but superior in courage and tactical genius, inflicted a crushing defeat on the Persians. Then followed the Battle of Plataea, where the united army of the Hellenes finally drove the invaders from their land. The war was won. When the Athenians returned to their ravaged city, they were met with a scene of complete devastation. But in the hearts of these people burned not the embers of despair, but a fire of unprecedented resolve. They would not just rebuild their city, they would build a new one, the likes of which the world had never seen. A city that would become a beacon for all of Hellas, a symbol of the victory of spirit over brute force, of reason over barbarism. They would build a city whose name would forever be associated with the golden age of humanity, and among those who returned to these ruins was a youth, almost a boy, from one of the noblest and most controversial families of Athens. His name was Pericles. At that moment, no one could have guessed that it would be his will, his mind, and his vision that would turn these smoking ashes into dazzling marble, that his name would become synonymous with an entire era. But the threads of fate were already intertwining into a tight knot. The path to the pinnacle of power, to immortal glory, would be long and perilous. It would be paved with political intrigues, fierce debates, personal tragedies, and the blood of thousands. This story is not just about a man. It is a story of the birth of a civilization from chaos, of the power of a single individual to change the world, and of the high, tragic price that must be paid for greatness. Before our main hero takes the stage, we must understand the setting in which he was to play his part. Athens of the 5th century before the Common Era did not appear out of nowhere. It was the product of a long, painful, and bloody struggle of ideas and ambitions. To understand the genius of Pericles, one must descend into the past, to the times when the very word democracy was but a bold and dangerous dream, and the shadows of ancient curses and the specter of tyranny hung over the city. This is a journey into the very heart of the Athenian polis, into its laws, its fears, and its hopes. The Athenian polis, at the time of Pericles' birth, around 495 before the Common Era, was a seething cauldron of social and political transformations. Behind were the dark ages of archaic Greece, the times of the omnipotence of the hereditary aristocracy, the so-called eupatridae, who owned the best lands and held all the levers of power. The common people, the demos, consisting of small landowners, artisans, and merchants, were virtually powerless. Debt slavery was a common phenomenon. A peasant unable to repay a debt to an aristocrat would lose not only his plot but also his freedom, becoming a slave along with his entire family. Tension had been growing for decades, threatening to erupt into a full-scale civil war. And then, at the turn of the 7th and 6th centuries, a man whose name became a legend stepped onto the stage, Solon. Elected archon with extraordinary powers, Solon carried out reforms that laid the first stone in the foundation of future democracy. He abolished debt slavery, enacting the Seisachtheia, which meant shaking off of burdens, and restored freedom to thousands of Athenians. He divided the citizens into 4 property classes, linking political rights not to noble birth but to income level. This was a revolutionary step, as now even a wealthy commoner could participate in governing the state. Solon created the Council of 400, 100 men from each of the 4 ancient tribes or philae, and established the Heliaea, the popular court to which any citizen could appeal. However, Solon's reforms were a compromise that did not fully satisfy anyone. The aristocrats were displeased with the loss of some of their privileges, while the poor felt the reforms did not go far enough, failing to give them the main thing, redistribution of land. This discontent was skillfully exploited by the ambitious aristocrat Peisistratus, relying on the poorest strata of the population. He seized power in Athens 3 times, eventually establishing a tyranny that, paradoxically, in many ways contributed to the strengthening of the polis. Peisistratus and his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, pursued a policy in the interests of peasants and merchants, gave them loans, began minting the famous Athenian coin with the owl, and launched a large-scale construction program, adorning the city with temples and an aqueduct. It was under them that Athens began to transform into a major cultural and economic center. But the very nature of tyranny, of sole power not limited by law, was alien to the Hellenic spirit. The end of the tyranny was bloody. After the assassination of Hipparchus by the conspirators Harmodius and Aristogeiton, who would later be honored as hero liberators, his brother Hippias tightened his rule. Finally, in 510 before the Common Era, he was expelled from Athens by the forces of the noble Alcmaeonid clan with the support of Spartan troops. And here the most interesting part begins. After the fall of the tyranny, the power struggle resumed with new force between 2 aristocratic factions. One was led by Anaxagoras, a supporter of oligarchy who relied on Spartan support. The other was led by Cleisthenes, a member of the very same Alcmaeonid clan. Anaxagoras initially gained the upper hand, and even exiled Cleisthenes and his supporters from the city. But then something unprecedented happened. The Athenian demos, unwilling to return to the rule of oligarchs, rose in revolt, besieged Anaxagoras and the Spartans on the Acropolis, and forced them to disgracefully capitulate. Returning to Athens on the wave of popular uprising, Cleisthenes, around 508 before the Common Era, carried out reforms that are rightly considered the birth of Athenian democracy in its classical form. His genius lay in completely breaking the old clan structure of society, which was the basis of aristocratic power. He divided all of Attica into 3 zones: the city of Athens, the coast, which was called Paralia, and the inland agricultural areas known as Mesogaea. He then divided each of these zones into 10 parts, or tritius. Finally, he created 10 new artificial philae, or tribes, with each tribe consisting of 3 tritius, 1 taken from each zone. What did this achieve? In each new tribe, city dwellers, sailors, merchants, and peasant farmers were now mixed. The old clan ties were severed. An aristocrat from a city mansion found himself in the same tribe as a fisherman from the coast and a plowman from the interior. This forced them to negotiate, to find common interests based not on kinship but on civic affiliation. The Council of 400 was replaced by the Council of 500, also called the Boule, with 50 men chosen by lot from each new tribe. The lot was a key instrument of democracy, as it presupposed that any citizen was worthy and capable of governing the state. It was Cleisthenes who introduced the famous procedure of ostracism, which was a judgment by potsherds. Once a year, the popular assembly ecclesia could, without trial or accusation, exile from the city for 10 years any politician who, in the opinion of the majority, had become too powerful and posed a threat to democracy. This was a preventive measure against a new tyranny. It was in this world, created by the reforms of Cleisthenes, that Pericles was born and raised. He was a son of his time, a time when the Athenian saw himself as a citizen, an equal among equals, possessing the right to vote and responsibility for the fate of his police. But at the same time, he was the heir to an ancient and powerful clan shrouded not only in glory but also in a dark curse. in the shadow of great reforms and against the backdrop of the thunder of the Persian Wars. A boy was growing up who was destined to become the embodiment of Athenian democracy, but whose enemies to the end of his days would whisper of the ancient curse that hung over his family. Before he became the Olympian, delivering speeches that shook Hellas, he was a quiet, withdrawn youth, absorbing the wisdom of the most daring minds of his time. Let us look into the world of his youth to understand what forces forged the character of the future first citizen of Athens. Pericles was born into the very heart of the Athenian establishment. His father, Xanthippus, was a prominent politician and military commander, a hero of the Persian Wars who commanded the Athenian fleet at the decisive Battle of Mycale in 479 before the Common Era, which finally crushed Persia's naval power. But even more noble was his mother, Agariste. She was the niece of the very same reformer Cleisthenes and belonged to the powerful and scandalously famous Alcmaeonid clan. The history of the Alcmaeonids is a true political thriller of antiquity. Their fame and their curse began over 100 years before Pericles' birth, during the so-called Solonian affair. An aristocrat named Solon, an Olympic champion, attempted to seize power and become a tyrant. His conspiracy failed, and his supporters took refuge at an altar on the Acropolis, which gave them sanctuary status. However, the Archon Megacles of the Alcmaeonid clan lured them away with a promise to spare their lives, but then treacherously ordered them to be slaughtered. This sacrilege, that is, the murder of suppliants at the altar of a goddess, cast an indelible stain on the entire clan. The Alcmaeonids were accused of pollution and were exiled from Athens several times. Their political opponents, especially in Sparta, used this accusation as a most powerful propaganda tool for decades. Every time an Alcmaeonid achieved success, he was reminded, "You have blood on your hands. You and your clan are cursed." Pericles would have this shouted in his face throughout his career. Thus, from childhood, Pericles was in a paradoxical situation. On the one hand, he belonged to the elite, to the clan that stood at the origins of democracy. On the other, this shadow of the past hung over him, forcing him to be more cautious, more restrained, and to doubly prove his devotion to the polis. The upbringing and education of young Pericles were the best that Athens could offer. His tutors were men whose ideas were ahead of their time. One of them was Damon, an outstanding music theorist. For the Greeks, music was not just entertainment. They believed that different modes and rhythms directly influenced the human soul, fostering courage or effeminacy, order or chaos. Damon taught Pericles not so much to play the kithara as to understand harmony, order, and measure, which, in his view, were the basis not only of music but also of state governance. It is likely from Damon that Pericles learned his famous self-control and ability to manage his emotions. But the main intellectual mentor who shaped Pericles' worldview was the philosopher Anaxagoras of Clazomenae. He was one of the first philosophers to settle in Athens. Anaxagoras was a true revolutionary of thought. He taught that the world consists of an infinite number of tiny particles, the seeds of all things, and that the driving force that orders this primordial chaos is not the whim of the Olympian gods, but an impersonal cosmic mind which he called nous. He asserted that the sun is not the god Helios in a fiery chariot, but a red-hot mass of rock larger than the Peloponnese, and the moon is a body similar to the earth, shining with reflected light. One can only imagine the stunning impression these ideas made on an inquisitive young mind in a world where thunder was considered the wrath of Zeus. Communication with Anaxagoras accustomed Pericles to rational thinking, to seeking logical causes for phenomena, and to skepticism towards superstitions and prejudices. This made him the first intellectual politician in history, one who based his activities not on prophecies and omens but on sober calculation and analysis. Plutarch wrote that it was thanks to Anaxagoras that Pericles became filled with a lofty mode of thought, and rid himself of the superstitious fear that celestial phenomena inspire in people who do not know their causes. This rationality would become his strength and, at the same time, the reason for accusations of impiety or Aspasia from his enemies. It is also believed that Pericles conversed with Zeno of Elea, a disciple of Parmenides, who was famous for his logical paradoxes or aporias, such as Achilles and the tortoise and the arrow. These exercises in dialectics sharpened his mind, taught him the art of debate, the ability to find weak points in an opponent's argumentation, and to construct his own speech with impeccable logic. Unlike many aristocrats of his time, Pericles in his youth shunned rowdy feasts and public life. He led a reclusive lifestyle, completely dedicating himself to study and preparation for a political career. Plutarch notes that in Athens he was seen walking on only one road, the one that led from his house to the agora, that is, the marketplace, the center of public life, and to the boule, the Council of 500. He did not accept invitations to dinners and avoided social gatherings, understanding that familiarity diminishes the dignity of a statesman. He developed a unique style of behavior in public speaking. His speech was calm even, and devoid of cheap demagogic tricks. He did not try to curry favor with the crowd or appeal to its fleeting emotions. Instead, he appealed to the citizens' reason. His arguments were balanced, his logic was ironclad. For this majestic manner and the thunderous power of his speeches, which seemed to emanate not from a mere mortal but from the heights of Olympus, he was, according to contemporaries, nicknamed the Olympian. He possessed the rarest gift of persuading the people to accept even unpopular but necessary decisions, leading them rather than pandering to their whims. This unique combination of aristocratic origin, democratic convictions, rational thinking, and flawless self-control prepared him for a great mission. Athens awaited its leader, and Pericles was almost ready. The political arena of Athens in the mid-5th century before the Common Era resembled a gladiatorial arena. Two titans, two different worlds, two visions of the future clashed on it. One was a war hero, the favorite of the aristocracy, a supporter of an alliance with Sparta. The other was a young, reserved intellectual, the leader of the Democratic Party, who saw Athens' greatness in its naval power and independence. Their collision was inevitable, and before Pericles could erect the Parthenon, he would have to destroy the last bastion of the old world, the sacred Areopagus. This is the story of how a new leader emerges from the shadows, and how sometimes, in order to create, one must first destroy. Pericles did not immediately burst into Athenian politics. He waited a long time observing and preparing. The political stage of Athens after the Persian Wars was completely dominated by Cimon, son of Miltiades, the victor of Marathon. Cimon was the complete opposite of Pericles. He was a typical representative of the old aristocracy, rich, generous, open, a brave commander, and a supporter of conservative values. He became famous for numerous victories over the Persians, leading the fleet of the Delian League, which was a defensive alliance of Greek city-states created for the continued fight against Persia. Cimon was fabulously wealthy from war spoils and spent his money to gain popularity with the people. He removed the fences from his gardens, allowing anyone to pick fruit there, hosted public dinners for the poor of his deme, or district, and always appeared accompanied by servants who distributed clothes to the needy. In foreign policy, Cimon was a staunch Laconophile, in other words, a supporter of an alliance with Sparta. He believed that Athens and Sparta were the two yokes that should pull the cart of Hellenic freedom together, and that their rivalry was ruinous for Greece. In domestic policy, he relied on the Areopagus. The Areopagus was the most ancient council, consisting of former archons who held their positions for life. Initially possessing immense power, by Pericles' time it had already lost many functions, but still retained crucial levers, such as control over the observance of laws, supervision of morals, and most importantly, judgment in cases of murder and serious crimes. The Areopagus was a bastion of aristocracy and conservatism, a break on the path of further democratization. Pericles, entering the political arena around the 460s before the Common Era, immediately joined the Democratic Party, becoming its leader. His main ally in this struggle was Ephialtes, a man of impeccable reputation, honest and incorruptible, a staunch opponent of oligarchy. Pericles and Ephialtes understood that as long as the Areopagus retained its power, democracy would not be complete. They began a systematic attack on this last bastion of the aristocracy. Pericles, using his oratorical skills, initiated one lawsuit after another in the popular court against individual members of the Areopagus, accusing them of corruption and abuse. This undermined the authority of the entire body in the eyes of the demos. The opportune moment for a decisive blow came in 462 before the Common Era. A massive earthquake occurred in Sparta, destroying the city, followed by a revolt of the Helots, the state slaves on whose labor the entire Spartan society depended. Sparta, finding itself in a desperate situation, appealed for help to its allies, including Athens. Cimon, true to his principles, persuaded the popular assembly to send a corps of hoplites under his command to Sparta. He said, "We must not allow Hellas to become lame and Athens to lose its second yoke." This decision was fatal for him. When the Athenian contingent arrived in Laconia, the Spartans, always suspicious of the meddlesome and revolutionary Athenians, feared they might side with the rebellious Helots. Under a flimsy pretext, they were the only allies to send the Athenian contingent back, publicly insulting Athens. The anger and humiliation felt by the Athenians were immense. Cimon's entire political capital, built on friendship with Sparta, collapsed overnight. While Cimon was on campaign, Ephialtes and Pericles wasted no time. They brought before the popular assembly a law that stripped the Areopagus of virtually all its political functions. From now on, control over laws and officials passed to the popular assembly, the Council of 500, and the popular court, the Heliaea. The Areopagus was left with only the functions of a court for intentional homicide and certain religious crimes. This was, in essence, a democratic coup, completing the work of Cleisthenes. Full power had finally passed into the hands of the demos. When Cimon returned to Athens, he tried to repeal the reform, but it was too late. His authority was undermined. In 461 before the Common Era, Pericles and his supporters achieved Cimon's ostracism. The leader of the aristocratic party was exiled from the city for 10 years. The way was clear for Pericles, but the victory was marred by tragedy. Shortly after the reform, Ephialtes was assassinated. At night, in the dark, an unknown assailant dealt him a fatal blow. The murderer was never found. Plutarch writes that rumors circulated among the people that the aristocrats, seeking revenge for the humiliation of the Areopagus, were behind it, and some even named a certain Aristodicus of Tanagra as the perpetrator. This murder showed how fierce the political struggle was. After the death of his senior comrade, Pericles was left as the sole leader of the Democratic Party. The power he had so long sought was now in his hands. But this was not just power for power's sake. Pericles had a grand plan. Power is not a goal, but a tool. Having obtained it, Pericles faced the main question: what to do with it? His answer changed not only the face of Athens, but the entire balance of power in the Greek world. Some would call him the creator of the greatest naval empire and the patron of the arts, who turned his city into the school of Hellas. Others would call him a tyrant who enslaved his allies and built his magnificent temples with money collected for the common defense. This chapter tells of Pericles' dual legacy, of the brilliance and shadow of the Athenian Empire, of how a military treasury was transformed into the budget for the most ambitious construction project in human history. Having become the first man in the state, Pericles began to implement his program, which consisted of three main parts: further democratization, strengthening Athens' military might, and transforming the city into the cultural and economic capital of Hellas. Pericles understood that Cleisthenes' democracy, though progressive, had one significant flaw. It was accessible mainly to wealthy citizens. A poor man who had to work every day to feed his family simply could not afford to spend time at meetings of the popular assembly, court, or council, even if he had the legal right to do so. To make democracy real, not just formal, Pericles introduced a revolutionary innovation: payment for public office. He secured the passage of a law by which members of the Council of 500, judges of the Heliaea, and other magistrates chosen by lot began to receive a salary for each day they performed their duties. The pay was not large, only 2 or 3 obols a day, which was roughly equivalent to the daily wage of an unskilled laborer. But it was enough for even the poorest citizen to participate in governing the polis without fear of starvation. Later, payment for attending the popular assembly was also introduced. In addition, Pericles introduced the theorikon, special funds for attending the theater. Theatrical performances in Athens were not just entertainment, but a crucial part of civic and religious education. On stage, tragedians like Sophocles and Euripides raised the most complex questions of morality, duty, and human destiny. Pericles believed that every citizen, regardless of wealth, should have access to these lessons. Pericles' opponents, mainly from aristocratic circles, cried that he was corrupting the people with handouts, accustoming them to dependency and turning citizens into mercenaries in the service of the state. But for Pericles, this was a matter of principle. He was making political participation not a privilege of the rich, but a real right and a paid job for all. But where was the money to come from for all these payments, as well as for maintaining the most powerful fleet and army? The answer was simple and cynical: from the treasury of the Delian League. The Delian League, as we remember, was created after the Persian Wars as a defensive alliance against Persia. Its center was the sacred island of Delos, where the common treasury was located. Members of the League, mostly island and coastal city-states of the Aegean Sea, were obliged either to provide ships for the common fleet or to contribute a monetary payment called phoros. Gradually, most allies preferred to pay money, shifting the entire burden of waging war onto Athens. The Athenian fleet became the core of the League's armed forces, and Athens, its undisputed hegemon. Under Pericles, this process of transforming the League into an empire, or as the Athenians said, an arche, reached its peak. Any attempt to leave the League was brutally suppressed. When the wealthy island of Thasos rebelled, the Athenians, after a long siege, captured it, tore down its city walls, confiscated its fleet, and forced it to pay a huge indemnity. A similar fate befell others. Allies were transformed from equal partners into subjects obliged to pay tribute to Athens. The culmination of this process was the transfer of the League's treasury from Delos to Athens in 454 before the Common Era, under the pretext of its better protection from the Persians. Now the Allies' money was under the complete control of the Athenians. Pericles saw nothing wrong with this. In one of his speeches reported by Thucydides, he says directly, "Our city has the greatest name among all men because she has never yielded to misfortunes and has spent more lives and labors in war than any other, and has gained the greatest power that ever existed. And if we should be forced to yield, the memory of our greatness will be left to posterity forever. We who were Hellenes and ruled over more Hellenes than any other Hellenic state. He believed that since Athens bore the entire burden of defending Hellas from the barbarians, it had every right to dispose of the allies' money as it saw fit. To strengthen control over the empire, Pericles widely used the practice of klerouches. These were Athenian military agricultural settlements on the territories of allies. Thousands of the poorest Athenian citizens received land plots in different parts of the Aegean, which solved three problems at once. It eased social tension in Athens, created strongholds of Athenian influence throughout the empire, and served as a constant reminder to the allies of who was in charge. And now we come to Pericles' most grandiose project, which immortalized his name. He decided to spend the enormous funds flowing into Athens from the empire's treasury to rebuild the Acropolis, destroyed by the Persians, with unprecedented splendor. This was not just a construction project, it was an ideological program. Pericles wanted to create a visible material symbol of Athens' power, wealth, and cultural superiority. The plan was grand. It involved the erection of a whole complex of buildings. The main jewel was to be the new temple of the city's patron goddess, Athena Parthenos, that is, the Virgin, which was named the Parthenon. The best architects, Ictinus and Callicrates, were invited to build it. Pericles entrusted the overall supervision of the project and the creation of the sculptural decoration to his friend, the genius sculptor Phidias. Construction began in 447 before the Common Era and lasted for 15 years. It was a gigantic construction site that provided work for thousands of people: stonemasons, carpenters, sculptors, painters, and haulers. Money flowed like a river, the very money of the allies. The opposition, led by a politician named Thucydides, who was not the famous historian but Cimon's father-in-law, fiercely attacked Pericles. They shouted, "Hellas sees that we, having taken the common treasury into our keeping, are shamelessly plundering it. Our city, like a wanton woman, hangs gold upon itself, adorning itself with precious stones and temples costing thousands of talents." In response, Pericles, speaking in the popular assembly, delivered a famous speech. He stated that Athens was not obliged to account to the allies for the money spent, since it fulfilled its main duty, protecting them from the Persians. He said, "Let them provide the money and we will do the fighting for it. That is a fair deal." And then he made a brilliant political move. He said, "If you think the expenses are too great, then let them be charged not to the people's account, but to my own personal one. But then the inscriptions on all these magnificent buildings will state that they were dedicated to the gods by Pericles, son of Xanthippus." This argument struck the people dumb. The Athenians, filled with pride, shouted for him to spend as much as he wanted from the public treasury, sparing nothing. And he spared nothing. The Parthenon became the pinnacle of architectural and artistic thought. Built of pure white, Pentelic marble, it was perfect in its proportions. The architects applied complex optical corrections, such as curvature and entasis, so that the building, which in reality has many curved lines, would be visually perceived as perfectly rectilinear and harmonious. Phidias's sculptural decoration was breathtaking. The metopes, square panels around the perimeter, depicted mythological battles: gods against giants, Greeks against Amazons, Lapiths against centaurs, the fall of Troy. All these were allegories of the main battle of civilization, that is, Athens, against barbarism, that is, Persia. Along the inner frieze ran a grand procession of the Panathenaia, the main Athenian festival, immortalizing in marble the entire Athenian people going to worship their goddess. And inside the temple stood a 12-meter statue of Athena Parthenos, made by Phidias in the chryselephantine technique, that is, of gold and ivory. The goddess's clothing alone was made of more than a ton of pure gold and was removable, in case of the state's financial difficulties. In addition to the Parthenon, The monumental gateway, the propylaea created by the architect Mnesicles, was erected on the Acropolis and was considered no less a masterpiece. Next to it was built a small, elegant temple of Nike Apteros, that is, wingless victory. Later, the complex Erechtheion, with its famous porch of the Caryatids, was also built. At the foot of the Acropolis, the Odeon, a covered building for musical contests, was constructed. Pericles' program turned Athens into the most magnificent city of the ancient world. But this beauty was built on imperial power and paid for with the tribute of enslaved allies. The golden age of Athens was golden only for the Athenians. For the rest of Hellas, it increasingly had the cold glint of steel, and this glint increasingly irritated Athens' main rival, Sparta. The clash of the two worlds was becoming inevitable. The greatness of an era is measured not only by the size of its temples and the power of its fleet. It is measured by the strength of the ideas born within it. Periclean Athens was not just a military and political capital. It was a melting pot of human thought, while stonemasons were shaping the marble for the Parthenon in the Agora, and in the homes of Athenians other masters were shaping concepts, honing logic, and questioning everything that had seemed unshakable. Let us enter this bustling world of ideas where a friend of Pericles dared to call the sun a stun, where tragedies taught citizens more than politicians, and where a barefoot man wandered whose questions would change Western philosophy forever. Pericles was not just a patron and a client. He was an active participant in the center of the intellectual life of his time. His home was open to the most brilliant and bold minds of Hellas. He created around himself an atmosphere of free thought in which philosophy, drama, history, and rhetoric flourished. The central figure in this intellectual circle remained the philosopher Anaxagoras. His teaching about nous, the cosmic mind, and his natural science views were food for Pericles' own mind. However, for most Athenians raised on the myths of Homer, such ideas were shocking and blasphemous. To declare that the celestial bodies were not deities but material objects was to attack the very foundations of religion and public order. Pericles' enemies could not attack him directly because of his popularity, so they struck at his circle. Anaxagoras was accused of Aspasia, or impiety. He faced the death penalty. Pericles, according to Plutarch, had to personally appear in court and with tears in his eyes begged the judges to spare his old teacher. In the end, Anaxagoras was either acquitted or, more likely, Pericles secretly helped him flee Athens. This trial became an alarming sign that even in the most democratic of cities, freedom of thought had its limits. At the same time, the sophists, who were itinerant teachers of wisdom, flocked to Athens. Figures like Protagoras, Gorgias, and Prodicus offered for a fee to teach anyone the art of eloquence, how to think, and most importantly, to make the weaker argument appear stronger. Protagoras proclaimed his famous thesis, "Man is the measure of all things," which meant a rejection of absolute truth and a shift in focus to subjective perception. For Athenian democracy, where everything was decided in the popular assembly and the courts, the ability to persuade was a vital skill. The sophists became the first professional educators who taught the art of political success. Pericles undoubtedly interacted with them, valuing their contribution to the development of rhetoric and logic, though he did not share their moral relativism. Theater in the age of Pericles reached its zenith. The great tragedians were not just writers, they were teachers of the people. Aeschylus, a veteran of the Battle of Marathon, in his tragedies like The Persians and the Oresteia trilogy, reflected on the victory over barbarism, the problems of divine justice, and the ancestral curse. Sophocles, who, according to tradition, was a friend of Pericles and even served as a general alongside him in his plays like Oedipus Rex and Antigone, explored the tragic fate of man confronting the will of the gods and the unwritten laws of morality. His heroes are integral, heroic natures. The youngest of the great trio, Euripides, was already a man of a new era, a skeptic and a psychologist. He brought his heroes down from their high stilts, showed their passions, doubts, and sufferings, criticized traditional myths, and questioned accepted values. His tragedies, for example, the Medea and the Trojan women, were full of sharp psychologism and sympathy for the suffering, even if they were the Trojan enemies. Pericles, as head of state, undoubtedly watched all these performances which were part of state festivals. These tragedies shaped the world-view of the citizens, making them reflect on the most complex questions of existence, and Pericles understood their immense educational role. At the same time, the father of history, Herodotus, was working in Athens. He traveled throughout the then-known world from Egypt to Scythia collecting material for his grand work on the Greco-Persian Wars, but it was not just a chronicle. Herodotus described the customs, geography, and history of different peoples, trying to understand the reasons for the great clash between East and West. His work, read according to tradition in Athens, was met with enthusiasm, and he himself received a large monetary reward from the Athenian government. And finally, it was in Periclean Athens that a young sculptor and stonemason, a strange barefoot man with an ugly face, was already walking the streets and squares, teaching no one but engaging everyone in conversation, asking them simple but deadly questions. What is good? What is justice? What is courage? His name was Socrates. He was the complete opposite of the sophists, as he took no money, claimed to know only that I know nothing, and with his ironic manner called Miletus, or the art of midwifery, he made his interlocutors doubt their own knowledge and begin the search for truth. For now, he was just one of many quirky figures in the Athenian agora, but his dialogues with young aristocrats like Alcibiades, a ward of Pericles, were already laying the foundation for all future Western philosophy. Periclean Athens was a place of incredible intellectual concentration. Here, old mythology clashed with new philosophy, faith in the gods with rational analysis, heroic tragedy with skeptical psychology. Pericles did not just encourage this. He himself was a product of this era and its active driver. He believed that Athens' strength lay not only in its fleet of 300 triremes and not only in the marble of the Parthenon, but also in the power of reason, in freedom of speech, and in constant intellectual inquiry. He created a city that became, in his own words, the school of Hellas. But this brilliant facade also had its reverse personal side, full of passions, scandals, and tragedies. Behind every great man, they say, there is a great woman. But what if this woman is a foreigner, a courtesan, and a philosopher all in one? What if her mind is sharper than that of many statesmen and her influence on the first citizen of Athens becomes the subject of sordid gossip and political attacks? The story of Pericles would be incomplete without the story of Aspasia of Miletus, the most famous and most slandered woman of classical Greece. This is a tale of a love that defied all conventions, and of how fragile the reputation of even the most powerful ruler was. Pericles' personal life before meeting Aspasia was quite traditional for an Athenian aristocrat. He was married to a relative, with whom he had 2 sons, Xanthippus and Pericles. However, this marriage, it seems, was not happy. By mutual consent they divorced, and Pericles married his ex-wife off to another man. His sons, especially the elder Xanthippus, grew up to be extravagant and feckless, and their relationship with their father was extremely strained. Xanthippus even spread dirty rumors about Pericles, telling anecdotes in the agora about his philosophical conversations at home. But his whole life was turned upside down when he met Aspasia. She came to Athens from Miletus, a prosperous Ionian city in Asia Minor, famous for its high culture. Aspasia was not just beautiful. She possessed a brilliant mind, an excellent education, and the gift of eloquence. Since she was not an Athenian citizen, she was not bound by the strict restrictions imposed on Athenian women from respectable families. An Athenian woman was supposed to live a secluded life, appearing in public only during religious festivals. Her lot was the home and children. Aspasia, however, was free. In Athens, she apparently kept a salon which was visited by the most prominent figures of the city, including Socrates and his disciples. Her status was ambiguous. Her enemies called her a hetera and a brothel keeper, accusing her of supplying noble Athenians with girls for their pleasure. Her friends, on the other hand, saw her as an outstanding intellectual whose advice was valued and whose speeches were listened to. Pericles fell head over heels in love with her. This love was so strong that he, the first citizen of Athens, lived with her openly as his wife, although under Athenian law their marriage could not be recognized as legitimate because she was a foreigner. Their son, also named Pericles, was considered illegitimate, or anothos, and had no civil rights. Plutarch writes that Pericles, known for his restraint, would tenderly kiss Aspasia every day when leaving and returning home, which was an unheard-of display of affection for an Athenian husband. Aspasia's influence on Pericles was apparently enormous, especially in the field of rhetoric. It was rumored that she helped him write his famous speeches. Socrates, according to Plato and Xenophon, spoke of her with great respect, calling her his teacher. In one of Plato's dialogues, Socrates even ironically attributes the authorship of Pericles' famous funeral oration to Aspasia. Of course, such a state of affairs could not but provoke fierce attacks from Pericles' enemies. The comic playwrights, whose plays were the main mass media of the time, mercilessly mocked them. Aspasia in comedies was called Omphale and Deianira, the names of mythical queens who had enslaved Heracles with their love, and Pericles himself was called the new Zeus and his beloved Hera. She was accused of all mortal sins. It was said that it was because of her, to please the Milesians, that Pericles had dragged Athens into a war with the island of Samos. And the most serious accusation was that she was allegedly corrupting Athenian women, leading them away from their families to participate in her intellectual, and perhaps not only intellectual, gatherings. Aspasia, like Anaxagoras, was accused of impiety and procuring. The prosecution was led by the comic poet Hermippus. This was a direct blow to Pericles. He again had to personally defend a person close to him. According to sources, during his speech in court, the Olympian Pericles, who never showed his feelings in public, could not contain himself and wept, begging the judges for mercy. The sight of the weeping first citizen had such an effect on the judges that Aspasia was acquitted. This story shows how vulnerable Pericles was in his personal life. His love for a foreigner, an intellectual, a woman with a scandalous reputation, was his strength and his weakness. It gave him the emotional and intellectual support he lacked in his first marriage, but it also gave his enemies an inexhaustible source for insinuations and political attacks. The relationship between Pericles and Aspasia was a unique phenomenon for classical Athens. It was a union of two brilliant minds, two strong personalities that challenged a conservative society. And this challenge, like the construction of the Parthenon, like the creation of an empire, was part of Pericles' great and audacious project to remake the world. However, clouds were already gathering on the horizon. Not personal scandals, but a major war was to become the main test for Pericles and his city. A peace concluded for 30 years rarely lasts even a third of that time, especially if it is made between two predators claiming the same prey. After decades of local skirmishes and growing rivalry, Hellas seemed to have found a fragile balance. But under this thin crust of ice, the lava of mutual distrust, economic grievances, and imperial ambitions was boiling. Soon, three small, seemingly insignificant conflicts in remote corners of the Greek world would become the sparks that would ignite an all-consuming fire. a fire that would go down in history as the Peloponnesian War. The period after the exile of Cimon and the reforms of Ephialtes was marked not only by internal transformations in Athens, but also by a change in foreign policy. Pericles abandoned Cimon's pro-Spartan policy and set a course for open rivalry with Sparta for hegemony in Greece. This led to the so-called First Peloponnesian War, which lasted from 460 to 445 before the Common Era. It was a series of local conflicts in which Athens allied with Sparta's enemies, Argos and Thessaly, and brought Boeotia and Phocis under its influence, extending its power over all of central Greece. The most important achievement of this period was the construction of the Long Walls, which were a corridor of two powerful walls connecting Athens with its port of Piraeus. This idea, attributed to either Pericles or Themistocles, had colossal strategic importance. Henceforth, Athens became an impregnable island fortress. Even if the enemy devastated all of Attica, the city, connected to the sea, could be freely supplied with food and resources from its entire naval empire. However, a war on two fronts, against Persia in the east and the Peloponnesian League led by Sparta in the west, was beyond Athens' strength. The catastrophic failure of the Athenian expedition to Egypt, sent to help rebels against the Persians where almost the entire fleet and army perished, forced Pericles to reconsider his policy. In 449 before the Common Era, the so-called Peace of Callias was concluded with Persia, which formally ended the Greco-Persian Wars. And in 446 or 445 before the Common Era, after Athens lost control over Boeotia and a Spartan army invaded Attica, Pericles was forced to conclude a 30 years peace with Sparta. This treaty effectively divided Hellas into two spheres of influence. Sparta recognized the Athenian maritime empire, and Athens renounced its claims to hegemony on land and dissolved its land-based alliance. The treaty forbade allies from switching sides but allowed neutral city-states to join either side. It seemed a compromise had been found, but in reality, it was just a respite. The fundamental contradictions had not disappeared. Sparta and its allies looked with alarm and hatred at the growing power and wealth of Athens. Athens, feeling itself master of the seas, behaved with increasing audacity and provocation. The peace lasted only 14 years. The historian Thucydides, a contemporary of the events and the main chronicler of the war, identifies the true and hidden cause of the conflict. He believed, "The real cause I consider to be the one which was formerly most kept out of sight. The growth of the power of Athens and the alarm which this inspired in Lacedaemon made war inevitable." But there were also specific pretexts, three knots that could not be untied by diplomacy. The first was the conflict over Corcyra, which is known today as Corfu. Corcyra was a wealthy island with a powerful fleet, second in strength only to Athens. It was a colony of Corinth, Sparta's main naval and commercial ally. A conflict broke out between Corcyra and Corinth over their joint colony of Epidamnus. It came to war, and the Corcyrians, fearing Corinth's might, turned to Athens for help, asking to be admitted into the league. The Athenians faced a difficult choice. To accept Corcyra meant to violate the spirit of the 30 years' peace, and to make a mortal enemy of Corinth. To refuse meant to allow the Corinthians to capture the powerful Corcyrian fleet and dramatically increase the naval power of the Peloponnesian League. Pericles found a compromise solution. He persuaded the popular assembly to conclude not an offensive, but a purely defensive alliance with Corcyra. At the Battle of the Sabota Islands between the fleets of Corinth and Corcyra, a small Athenian squadron at first observed from the sidelines, but when the Corcyrians began to lose, the Athenians intervened, preventing the Corinthians from achieving a complete victory. For Corinth, this was tantamount to a declaration of war. The second pretext was the siege of Potidaea. Potidaea, a city on the Chalcidic Peninsula, was in a unique position. It was a member of the Athenian League and paid phoros, but at the same time it was a colony of Corinth and annually received high officials from there. Fearing that Potidaea, under Corinth's influence, would secede from the League, the Athenians demanded that it tear down part of its fortifications, give hostages, and no longer accept Corinthian magistrates. Potidaea refused and rebelled. The Athenians besieged the city. Corinth in turn saw this as an encroachment on its interests and sent a detachment of volunteers to aid the besieged. The third cause was the Megarian decree, or psephisma. This was the most painful measure for Sparta's allies. Megara, a small city-state wedged between Attica and the Isthmus of Corinth, was a member of the Peloponnesian League. Under the pretext that the Megarians were allegedly plowing sacred land dedicated to the goddess Demeter and harboring runaway Athenian slaves, Pericles pushed through the popular assembly a decree that forbade Megarian merchants from trading in the Athenian market and from entering all ports of the Athenian Empire. For Megara, whose economy was closely tied to maritime trade, this was an economic blockade, tantamount to strangulation. Corinth and Megara, driven to desperation, turned to Sparta, accusing Athens of violating the peace and of aggression. In 432 before the Common Era, a congress of the Peloponnesian League was held in Sparta. After fiery speeches by the Corinthians who accused the Spartans of slowness, and a speech by Athenian envoys defending their right to an empire, the Spartan Popular Assembly, the Apella, concluded by secret ballot that the Athenians had violated the treaty. War was decided. The Spartans, however, did not rush to start hostilities and sent several embassies to Athens with ultimatums. First, they demanded that the Athenians drive out the curse of the Alcmaeonids, which was a personal jab at Pericles and a reminder of his family's ancient curse. Then the demands became more specific: to lift the siege of Potidaea and, most importantly, to repeal the Megarian decree. Heated debates began in Athens. Many were ready to make concessions to avoid war, but Pericles was adamant. He addressed the popular assembly with one of his most famous speeches. He argued that a concession in a small matter, the Megarian decree, would be seen as a sign of weakness and would lead to new, even more humiliating demands. He said, "If you give way, you will instantly have to meet some greater demand. A firm refusal will make them clearly understand that they must treat you as equals." Pericles outlined his strategic plan for the war. He understood that on land, the Athenian hoplite army could not stand against the invincible Spartan phalanx. Therefore, he proposed a defensive strategy on land and an active one at sea. When the Spartans invaded Attica, the entire rural population was to take refuge behind the long walls, abandoning their homes and fields to be plundered. Athens, turned into an impregnable island fortress, would be supplied with everything necessary by sea. At the same time, the powerful Athenian fleet would ravage the coast of the Peloponnese, inflicting economic damage on the enemy and undermining its prestige. Pericles was confident that Sparta, lacking large financial reserves, would simply not have the resources for a long war and would be forced to sue for peace on terms favorable to Athens. Pericles' speech convinced the Athenians. They rejected the Spartan ultimatum. There was no longer a way back. In 431 before the Common Era, Sparta's ally, Thebes, attacked Athens' ally, Plataea. The Great Peloponnesian War, which would last 27 years and destroy more than one generation of Hellenes, had begun. Even the most brilliant plan, the most sober calculation, can be destroyed by a force that cannot be foreseen and cannot be controlled. Pericles had calculated everything: the power of the fleet, the impregnability of the walls, the financial resources. But he had not accounted for one thing: an enemy invisible and merciless, which would come not from the land or the sea, but would penetrate the very heart of the overcrowded city. The last years of this great strategist's life became a race for survival. where on one side of the scales lay his military strategy, and on the other, a plague that was mowing down his people, his family, and, in the end, himself. This is a finale worthy of a Greek tragedy. The war began exactly according to Pericles' plan. In the spring of 431 before the Common Era, a huge Peloponnesian army under the command of the Spartan king Archidamus invaded Attica. As planned, the entire rural population, abandoning their homes, farms, and olive groves, streamed into Athens, filling all the space between the long walls. The city turned into a gigantic, overcrowded refugee camp. The Spartans freely cut down olive trees and burned crops, trying to lure the Athenian army into a decisive field battle. But Pericles was adamant. He did not allow the Athenians to go outside the walls, despite their anger and grumbling. Instead, he sent a fleet of 100 triremes to ravage the coast of the Peloponnese. The first year of the war went as Pericles had predicted. The Spartans, after staying in Attica for about 40 days and failing to force a battle, went back. The Athenian fleet operated successfully at sea. In the winter, the Athenians buried the first fallen of the war with due solemnity. It was then that Pericles delivered his famous funeral oration, which Thucydides records in his history. In this speech, he did not so much mourn the fallen as glorify the political system for which they had given their lives. He praised Athenian democracy, the openness of society, the equality of all before the law, the pursuit of beauty, and the love of wisdom. This speech became an immortal monument to the Athenian ideal, an apologia for the civilization the city was defending. But in the second year of the war, in the summer of 430 before the Common Era, the unforeseen happened. A terrible epidemic broke out in the overcrowded, unsanitary city. The historian Thucydides, who himself fell ill and survived, has left us a chilling, clinically precise description of the disease. Modern scholars still debate what it was: typhoid fever, bubonic plague, smallpox, or some form of hemorrhagic fever. The disease began with a high fever, redness of the eyes and throat. Then came coughing, sneezing, stomach cramps, vomiting, and unquenchable thirst. The body was covered with sores. Most died on the 7th or 9th day. The plague, in Greek, loimos, had a devastating effect not only on the physical, but also on the moral state of the Athenians. Human and divine laws ceased to apply. People, seeing the rich and poor, the righteous and the wicked die alike, cast off all shame and fear. They abandoned sick relatives, did not bury the dead who lay in heaps in the streets and temples. The city plunged into a chaos of despair and lawlessness. The plague claimed, according to various estimates, from a quarter to a third of Athens' entire population, including the best warriors and rowers. Against the backdrop of this horror, Pericles' strategy began to falter. The Spartans invaded Attica again. The Athenians, driven to desperation by plague and war, turned their anger on the man who had drawn them into this war. Pericles, who had recently been their idol, became an object of universal hatred. They sent envoys to the Spartans with a plea for peace, but were refused. Then they removed Pericles from his post as general and, accusing him of embezzlement, imposed a heavy fee on him. At the same time, the plague struck his own family. His sister died, and then both his legitimate sons from his first marriage, Xanthippus and Pericles. Plutarch tells that Pericles, who had always maintained an Olympian calm, bore these losses with dignity, but when his last legitimate son, Pericles, died, his fortitude failed him. Placing a wreath on his son's body, he broke down and wept. However, the Athenians, having tried to manage without Pericles, quickly realized that they could not find a replacement for him. None of the new politicians possessed his authority and strategic vision. Their anger having cooled, they re-elected him general and restored his full power. Touched by his personal tragedy, they even took an unprecedented step and, by a special law, changed his own law on citizenship, recognizing his son by Aspasia, Pericles the Younger, as a legitimate heir and a full citizen. It seemed that Pericles had regained control of the situation. But the disease was already undermining him as well. He had contracted not the acute form of the plague, but some lingering version of it that slowly drained his strength. He died in the autumn of 429 before the Common Era. Plutarch recounts a touching scene at his deathbed, when his friends gathered around were listing his great victories and achievements. Thinking he could no longer hear them, Pericles raised himself up and said, "You praise things in which chance had no small part, and which have happened to many other commanders, but you do not speak of the greatest and most beautiful thing in my life. For in all the years of my power, no Athenian citizen ever put on a black mourning cloak because of me." He considered his greatest achievement not the Parthenon or the empire, but the fact that, possessing almost monarchical power, he had never resorted to political repression and executions. The death of Pericles became a turning point in the history of Athens and the entire war. The one man who could restrain the extremes of both the aristocratic and democratic parties was gone. After him, demagogues of a new type came to power like the tanner Cleon, men who did not lead the people but pandered to their basest instincts, greed and cruelty. And the war became even more fierce and merciless. Athens, having lost its helmsman, rushed towards its tragic destiny, the catastrophe in Sicily, and final defeat in 404 before the Common Era. A man's death is not the end of his story. The real story begins afterward, when the voices of contemporaries fall silent and posterity tries to make sense of the legacy left behind. The shadow of Pericles proved to be incredibly long. It covered not only the subsequent centuries of Greek history, but reached down to our own day. But who was he really, this man whose name became synonymous with an entire era? A builder of democracy, or a tyrant who hid behind its name? An enlightened patron of the arts, or a cynical imperialist? The answer, like history itself, is complex and multifaceted. For the historian Thucydides, who knew him personally, the answer was clear. He wrote that it was in name a democracy, but in fact, the rule of the first citizen. Thucydides admired his foresight, his ability to manage the people without fawning over them, and considered his strategy the only correct one. In his opinion, Athens lost the war not because Pericles' plan was bad, but because his successors did the exact opposite, abandoned the defensive strategy, and got involved in risky adventures like the Sicilian expedition. The philosopher Plato, writing a generation later, was much harsher. For him, an aristocrat and a student of Socrates, Pericles was the one who had definitively corrupted the Athenian people by introducing pay for public office. He had turned the citizens into lazy, greedy, and litigious dependents. He had filled the city not with virtuous citizens, but with docks, shipyards, and walls, forgetting the main thing, the education of the soul. He had built a magnificent shell, but left it without moral content. Assessments have changed over the centuries. For Roman republicans, he was a model statesman. For Renaissance thinkers, he was a symbol of the harmony of reason and beauty. For the figures of the American and French revolutions, he was one of the founding fathers of democracy. In the 19th century, historians saw in him sometimes a prototype of an enlightened monarch, sometimes the architect of a nation-state. The long-term legacy of Pericles is undeniable and colossal. In politics, he brought Athenian democracy to its logical conclusion, creating a model that, with all its flaws, such as the exclusion of women, slaves, and medics, became for millennia an ideal of direct popular rule. His concept of an empire based on naval power and the economic exploitation of allies became a prototype for many future powers. In culture, his name is inextricably linked with the greatest surge of creative genius in human history. The Parthenon and the Acropolis remain unsurpassed masterpieces of architecture, symbols of classical harmony. The drama of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides laid the foundations for all European theater. The philosophy of Socrates, which originated in his time, became a turning point in the history of thought. In ideology, he created the immortal image of Athens as the school of Hellas, as a civilizational center opposing barbarism. His funeral oration is an eternal manifesto of an ideal democratic society to which politicians all over the world still appeal today. But one must not forget the dark side of this legacy. The Golden Age was paid for with the blood and tribute of hundreds of other Greek cities. Democracy for Athenians turned into tyranny for their allies. The striving for hegemony led to the most destructive war in the history of ancient Greece, which undermined the strength of the Hellenic world and ultimately opened the way for the Macedonian conquest. Pericles is a tragic figure in the highest sense of the word. He was a man who sincerely believed in the greatness of his city and his people. He possessed the intellect, will, and vision to raise Athens to an unattainable height. But the very nature of power and imperial ambitions, the very forces he used for creation, ultimately led him and his city to disaster. His story is an eternal reminder of how closely intertwined greatness and tragedy, creation and destruction, freedom for some and slavery for others are. He wanted to build a city that would be a monument for all time, and he succeeded. Only this monument turned out to be not only dazzlingly white, like Pentelic marble, but also dark crimson, like the bloodshed in the Peloponnesian War. And in this contradiction lies his eternal, enduring significance.